Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Bayliss, and I'm here to talk to you, the Board of Directors, about servant leadership at Berkshire Industries. Today is December 16, 2018, and I am a student at the University of Maryland University College, DMG Class 810, Section 9040.
Here is a list of topics that I would like to go over with you today. First, it is important that you know this research effort is conducted using evidence-based management framework. We'll spend some time discussing evidence-based management. I'll walk you through the steps of this framework and its application to servant leadership at Berkshire Industries. We execute the steps in this framework to answer the question, would introducing servant leadership at Berkshire Industries improve organizational performance, as is suggested by Melchar and Bosco in their 2010 article, Achieving High Performance Through Servant Leadership. This discussion will segue into the list of conclusions and recommendations that I have prepared for you today. Before we dive into the details of evidence-based management framework, I'd like to share with you a story adopted from Bruns, Rousseau, and Brenner in 2014 that will help relay to you the importance of evidence-based management. Consider, if you will, a hypothetical situation where you visit a dietitian looking for help with weight loss. The dietitian recommends a current fad diet on the market. This diet involves a set of supplements and a meal plan. The dietitian makes this recommendation to you based on the premise that this diet has earned such a hype in the weight loss market. There are so many people reporting their amazing results, and the author of the book associated with this diet has sold millions of copies. You decide to take on the dietitian's recommendation and give it a try. A few weeks later, instead of losing weight, you gain weight. You go back to the dietitian and ask what happened, and the dietitian says something like, "This diet's been working for everyone else. I don't know why it hasn't worked for you." In this situation, would you consider yourself to have been misled? In other words, do you believe that experts, such as dietitians, have a moral obligation to use the best available scientific evidence when providing recommendations? I believe yes, we do have a moral obligation to use the best available scientific evidence when presenting a recommendation as an expert. This is why the associated evidence-based framework, which I've followed in this research, is so valuable. The steps of this framework walks us through the process of asking, acquiring, appraising, aggregating, applying, assessing, and ensuring the integration of the various facets of scientific research into our decision-making methodology right here in the management discipline. If we were to apply this framework to the topic of servant leadership at Berkshire, our question would be, would introducing servant leadership at Berkshire Industries improve the organizational performance? I took the liberty of acquiring the body of literature associated with servant leadership, and I narrowed down the findings to the following 5 articles. This includes Melchar and Bosco's 2010 article, Achieving High Organizational Performance Through Servant Leadership.
In the appraisal step of the framework, I appraised the evidence found in these articles by testing the trustworthiness of the articles. I did that by examining the research methods and the associated descriptive statistics. I assessed the value of the evidence based on its relevance to the environment where the study is conducted and its possible translation to our environment at Berkshire Industries. The intersection of these two main themes, critically assessed against our body of evidence, produced the evaluating criteria that led us to identify whether the conclusions from an article at hand can be translated into Berkshire Industries. I'll walk you through the appraisal process and some of the important findings of each one of the articles. But before that, I'd like to present you with the list of criteria that I used during this appraisal. This is the list of criteria, of evaluating criteria that I was talking about earlier. It's a checklist of sorts. It represents areas of common error that occur during the study and affect the study's validity. First, an article needs to include adequate definitions of all the variables at hand, so there is no misunderstanding among the readers as to what is being studied. Topics such as servant leadership, organizational culture, and job satisfaction need to be clearly articulated before any meaningful use of these variables can be considered. Another requirement is the explicit mention by the authors of the objective and the hypothesis of the study. It is important for the audience to understand what the authors set out to achieve. It's also important for the reader to be able to conduct supplemental research if they wish, or recommend process improvements to the authors. An audience cannot achieve either capability without an explicit mention of the research objective and the hypothesis. Furthermore, the conclusions of the study need to be supporting that stated objective. This is important because the research process must be repeatable. Fellow scholars must be able to replicate the work conducted in this research and draw similar conclusions. Another area that requires attention is the proper utilization of the Likert scale. In some of these studies, we notice the questionnaires disseminated to participants include a 4-point Likert scale. So participants have the option of responding to a given question on a survey as strongly agreeing, agreeing, disagreeing, or strongly disagreeing, as an example. As demonstrated by Pornell and Saldana in 2013, a 4-point Likert scale that does not provide the option for a neutral response skews the responses of participants, as they are forced to either agree or disagree with the topic they may be feeling neutrally about due to the absence of that neutral optional answer. It's also important for a research effort investigating a claim to provide proof of causality when investigating a hypothesis and not merely settle for evidence of correlation among variables. This is a common oversight in research. When statistical data suggests a correlation between variables, sometimes it's misunderstood for causality. By emphasizing the importance of the presence of causality, we minimize our risk for undertaking this common misunderstanding. It's also important for a research article to use statistically sound analysis methods that are suitable for the type of data at hand. For example, the statistical methods used for studying two features among a sample are different than the methods used for studying one feature in two different samples. Finally, the topic of external validity is important because research is intended to explain to us the relationships of the world around us by being able to apply conclusions from a research to another environment. In this research, it becomes valuable to be able to apply the conclusions made onto the external environment. Having discussed the list of criteria, I'll walk you next through the appraised articles in the order of least satisfactory to most satisfactory, and I'll explain some of the strengths and the weaknesses attributed to each one of the research topics on servant leadership. When appraising Melcar and Bosco's 2010 Achieving High Organization Performance Through Servant Leadership, we find that even though the article does define the variables of the study and states the objective of seeking to investigate whether servant leadership style yields a servant leadership culture within an organization, the conclusion of the study is about the value of servant leadership rather than the relationship between leadership and culture. Furthermore, causality is not established between all the variables. The study uses a 4-point Likert scale instead of a 5 or a 7. The study also uses the statistical method ANOVA in panel B of table 5 to study the relation between servant leadership and the highest level of education among participants. An ANOVA study is appropriate when data is continuous, and in this case, this research notes that the mode of the highest level of education is completed high school, suggesting that the level of education is collected in an ordinal and not a continuous manner. Therefore, the use of ANOVA in this case is incorrect. When studying Newbert, Carlson, Kamar, Shonko, and Roberts 2008, Regulatory Focus as a Mediator of the Influence of Initiating Structure and Servant Leadership on Employee Behavior, the research adopts some of the same mistakes as Melcar and Bosco in the previous slide. The stated objective in this study is to test a model where regulatory focus of employees mediates the influence of leadership on employee behavior. The study concludes that regulatory focus is a two-part factor, and each one of these factors communicates a different message to employees. There is no mention of the mediation of the influence of leadership on employee behavior. Even though the study does use a 5-point Likert scale and uses statistically sound methods based on the collected data, The study cannot be replicated, nor can the external validity of the work be utilized, because the gap between the objective and the conclusion is big, and the failure to prove the causal relationship to explain the correlation between the found variables. When appraising Newman, Schwartz, Cooper, and Sanjaya's 2015 How Servant Leadership Influences Organizational Citizenship Behavior, the roles of LMX, empowerment, and proactive personality, we find the study satisfies more criteria than the first two articles. The only two identified weaknesses in this article is that the causal relationship between the variables is not established. The authors use statistically sound methods and sampling technique. They collect the data, draw conclusions and inferences, however, are unable to prove that the favorable results are those of servant leadership. The authors also may have influenced the results of the study by removing the potential for participants to answer the surveys anonymously. They forced the employees to include their name on their responses. Furthermore, the researchers bribed the participants of the survey with raffles to increase participation. This may have triggered a cultural feature of the Chinese community where positive reciprocation may be considered obligatory after these kind of gestures from the research conductors, possibly skewing the representation of the situation in the industry. This eliminated the external validity use of the study. In studying servant leadership, procedural justice climate, service climate, employee attitudes, and organizational citizenship behavior, a cross-level investigation by Wulumbwa, Hartnell, and Oak 2010, we notice the only significant weakness of this research is the effort's inability to establish causality among the individual and group level variables at the study. Due to the short nature of the questionnaire design, not enough information was harnessed by the authors to infer causality relationship. The research done by Lee, Kim, and Cho in 2018, a study on the relationship between servant leadership, organizational culture, and job satisfaction in fitness clubs, satisfies all the criteria we're looking for in an empirical study concerning servant leadership. The authors explicitly state the objective of studying the relationship between the variables servant leadership, organizational culture, and job satisfaction in the sport industry. The authors sampled 320 employees and received responses from 300 participants. The authors conclude that servant leadership in fitness club has a positive influence on organizational culture and job satisfaction. The authors are able to prove the causality relationship between these variables through the analysis of the collected data. It's important to note that the authors make this conclusion about servant leadership in fitness clubs, and their conclusions are successfully generalized to the sports industry.
This is a list of the aggregated conclusion that I compiled after the evidence assessment. The common scholarly conclusion shows that altruistic calling, emotional healing, wisdom, persuasion, and stewardship are inseparable characteristics of servant leadership. Even though the scholars have found correlations between servant leadership and high organizational performance, a generic causal relationship that can be generalized to other industrial environments has not been established.
From the successful study of Lee, Kim, and Cho's on the relationship between servant leadership, organizational culture, and job satisfaction of fitness clubs, we can learn to apply research at Berkshire Industries by similarly defining the variables we intend to study, clearly articulating our objective, and design our research in an effort to prove causality while using a 5 to 7 Likert scale where applicable. By conducting our research in this manner, we will improve our chances at external validity and improve our confidence in any changes we decide to make at Berkshire Industries. My recommendation to you is that we can conduct our own empirical study as mentioned above and use the found data to make a statistically confident prediction about what the impacts of applying servant leadership at Berkshire Industries could look like. Thank you.